Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to, great pleasure, to join the Master of Peterhouse in welcoming you to the third Raymond and Beverly Sackler Distinguished Lecture in honour of Norman Hammond. Prominent people talking about prominent places has been a leitmotif of this young and soon to become more venerable series since its inception, starting with Peter Adaman at Jorvik, then on to Steve Houston at El Zotz, a very different prominent place in the Maya lowlands, and now to Professor Martin Biddle at Winchester. Martin Biddle's a household name in terms of the rise and maturation of medieval archaeology in the UK, as well as the all-period archaeology of and under towns from Winchester, where he is, I believe, an honorary freeman of the city, to St Albans and Jerusalem, and indeed very briefly to a far earlier city, if we can call it such, the city of Jericho, for his, which I believe he may touch upon briefly at an early stage of his talk. For his services to archaeology and the nation's historical monuments, he has been appointed OBE and CBE, and has been a Fellow of the British Academy for over 30 years. His has been one of those enchanted and deservedly rewarded lives in archaeology, starting as a schoolboy, then excavating Henry VIII's palace at Nonsuch as an undergraduate, and then proceeding to the heights of academe and the chair of medieval archaeology at Oxford and a fellowship, now emeritus, at Hartford College. His lecture tonight draws together many of these threads and takes us back, both back to the beginning for what I'm sure will be a magnificent retrospective of a life bringing to light the idea of urbanism, the growth of urbanism throughout much of northwestern Europe and particularly in these islands. But it will also, I'm sure, be a clarion call for the future of this field of archaeology in general and particularly of urban archaeology. Martin, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to Cambridge to deliver this lecture, Capital, Considerations, Winchester and the Birth of Urban Archaeology.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In his report in the Times on February the 11th, on the publication of the most recent and 8th volume of Winchester Studies, Norman Hammond called Winchester England's ancient capital. What the devil does he mean by that? Well, I'll come to that later. Now, it's a very, very great honour to give a lecture founded by the ever generous Sackler family in honour of my very old friend Norman Hammond. I mean, the Sacklers really are quite extraordinary. Their intellectual range is amazing, no less than their extraordinary generosity. Whether it be medical or scientific, whether it be the support of the British Museum, the Louvre or the Met, it is an amazing range, and an amazing range of fellowships, scientific, biomedical, physical sciences, and not least, of course, in archaeology, in honour of our friend Norman Hammond, and the establishment thereby of the Raymond and Beverly Sackler Distinguished Lectureship in honour of Norman. And that's what I'm talking to with very great pleasure this evening. Now, with his gifts of books over very many years, Norman has ensured that I've remained aware of the marvels of Mayan archaeology and art. But it's only really quite recently that I realised how involved he's also been in the archaeology of Afghanistan. The Maya I have visited, Afghanistan I have not. But Norman tells me that the second edition of his archaeology with others of Afghanistan is either forthcoming or just has forthcome. I'm not quite sure which, but it's an amazing achievement. And I'm particularly grateful to Norman for introducing me to Mayan art and archaeology, which I've been able to see several times on the ground when I was director of the University Museum in Philadelphia, for example, with some of the splendid people working on various sites then. And I had the wonderful experience of one of my colleagues at the University Museum, Christopher Jones, on the progress of the deciphering of the Maya glyphs. I hadn't been at the museum very long before he started putting his head round my door every morning and said, "Got another glyph today, another glyph today." It was most exciting, and as a former classicist, a classical linguist, I found it of particular interest. But at any rate, let's come to Winchester. if we may. But we'll go first to Jerusalem, because Winchester for me has been an intellectual journey, begun by chance and pursued now for nearly 6 decades. And where, in a sense, did it begin? Well, in a sense, it begins in a city which we must all, despite the current political problems, recognise as a quintessential capital of various peoples, of various persuasions, but undoubtedly a capital city in the sense of a spiritual, of an administrative, of a commercial capital of the greatest importance. And this picture, which I took for you, indeed, on Friday morning, shows the last moments that I was in Jerusalem this year, working with my many friends there on the tomb of Christ, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But we mustn't talk about that today. But I do want to use this picture because 60 years before, it introduced me to Jericho. I was a second lieutenant commanding a troop of 5 tanks in a squadron in Berlin. And in the army cuts of that year, we were going to be disbanded, the first of many. What the devil was I going to do for another 4 months in the army? I knew what. I would go back to my regiment. I would be a gash second lieutenant. I'd have nothing to do, and so I'd be on orderly duty the whole time. So I wrote to Mortimer Wheeler, whom I was very fortunate to have known, and indeed to have dug with, at Stanwick. And I said, this is the position. I've got 4 months free. Can you help me? 48 hours later came one of Wheeler's typical letters. Dear Biddle, I have spoken to Kathleen Kenyon. You will go to dig for her at Jericho. Yours sincerely, Mortimer Wheeler. 48 hours later, my commanding officer got a copy of that letter. Martin, come here. What the hell is this? Well, sir, you know perfectly well what would have happened with me if I went back to the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, so I decided to try and do something else. And this is the result of it. Well done, well done. And so, in mid-October 1957, I commanded my tank troop on Hitler's Olympiaplatz, where the British headquarters then were, in Berlin. And 2 weeks later exactly, I was hiring a great American car at the Damascus Gate of Jerusalem to go down to Jericho. And there, Kathleen Kenyon, on the very first moment, took me to this enormous trench on the right-hand side, which others, of course, had dug before me, and said, it's dirty, clean it up. And so I did, and I had this marvellous group of chaps from the refugee camps north and south of Jericho. I learnt some extremely interesting Arabic, some of it completely not only unreproducible, but unquotable, I think, in the situation. But that was Jericho. It was a wonderful time. I came back. I had 8 months before coming up here to Pembroke, whose tie, as you can see, I wear today, and no money and nothing to do. So I got in touch with John Hurst, another Cambridge man, then working for the Ministry of Works, as it was then called, and I got a job, and I got 3 sites to dig. During that time, I learnt an enormous amount more, and came a little bit later, because of that experience, to excavate the site of Nonsuch Palace, which I and a group of now famous Cambridge undergraduates, Colin Renfrew, Peter Adaman, people like that, were supervisors on that excavation that we did. I'd come across Nonsuch as a schoolboy because my school was near one of Henry VIII's and Wolsey's minor palaces, and we excavated that during the time I was at school and finished writing it up the day before I went in the army. But in that time I got to hear of Nonsuch, and I saw the picture, not the coloured one, which had only been discovered subsequently, and I decided something I really must go and find out what it's. A lost palace. Nobody seems to know anything about it. And so we did, and in the summer of 1959, the end of my first year as an undergraduate, you can see our excavation in progress from the air, not, I'm afraid, in colour, to my lasting disappointment, but at any rate a good black and white showing this excavation of the entire site of the palace, with its enormous implications for the history of Italian and French art in England in the mid-16th century. But it was that experience, of course, which led me to undertake other work, and eventually to Winchester. Now, let me say a little bit more about that in Winchester and the beginning of it all. Winchester is central southern England, as you know, inland from Southampton, as we'll see in one or other of the slides later on. Head of the greatest natural harbour on the south coast of England. Very important point, I think. And in these two pictures, the one on the left shows you the Iron Age hill fort of St Catherine's Hill, excavated by Christopher Hawkes in the late 1920s. And then you see the earthworks of that in the bottom right-hand corner of the right-hand slide, and looking up the valley of the Itchen, towards what you can really only in a sense see dimly in the past, but dominating it perhaps, the great ship of its cathedral, which dominates the city and will be an important part of what I'm going to talk about today. Now, Winchester. How did I become in Winchester? It's a funny story, but essentially it's this. A King's man, Roger Quirk, who was very proud of being the only scientist who worked in the Hailsham's Department of Education at the time. His father had been a canon treasurer of the cathedral, and his mother still lived there, and she told him that Trust Houses were going to build a new hotel on a site which, dear Roger, you've just shown is the site of the great Newminster Church of Winchester. Roger, not for nothing a CB and a top Under-Secretary, immediately got a committee together, and they decided that something should be done about this. And amongst them, they took Donald Harden, who was then the head of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and asked Donald to suggest who might do a dig on this site in Winchester. And Donald said, well, I saw Martin Biddle's excavations at Nonsuch a couple of years ago. I think you better ask him. And so I was asked, and initially I demurred, but then I thought, well, perhaps it would be interesting to see what happened. The site was where is now the Wessex Hotel. If you look at the top left-hand side, you can see a horrible building with a big square and a square in the middle of it behind a couple of trees, and that's the Wessex Hotel. I may even be able, perhaps, to point to it. Yes, I probably can. There it is, up there. And that was a car park, covered, as you can see here, with tarmac. When we started, the local museum curator had dug 3 trenches, 4 foot by 4 foot, till he got down to the post-medieval burials on the site and said there was nothing to find. But that wasn't satisfactory to some people, and so I was asked to go and do a dig there. And I turned up one day in July with myself and 6 council workmen, and that's all we were. But I called on my Cambridge friends, and before long we had people looking after finds and supervising and drawing and so forth, and you can see the excavation in progress, and my goodness, doesn't it look old-fashioned. Long, narrow trenches, not much open area, though it's beginning to develop, as one can just see in the back of that slide there. Just beginning to develop large open areas. But the astonishing thing was how much it revealed. It revealed the Roman Forum, the east range of it, to the west end of the hotel site. This magnificent section of one of the major north-south streets of Roman Winchester, never before investigated, drawn here for the first time. Then Roman buildings to the east, and on top of it all, a very, very complicated set of, first of all, a chapel, and then 9th, 10th century burials, and then some large buildings which probably belonged to one of the great minsters, not the church itself, but probably the abbot's restaurant. So the abbot's residence. So we had a Roman street, the east range of the Forum, a Roman townhouse, and then really what? Well, mud, a streambeds cutting through it, destroying the archaeology, but representing a stage when Winchester was going through a very curious kind of interlude. And then the 9th and 10th century chapel, to which I've referred, and then the house of the Norman abbot. But the real point about it was that nothing was being done in Winchester in advance of modern development. The museum curator, Frank Cottrell, great experience in watching Roman sites in London in the 30s and then later in Leicester, did what he could. He was just a single chap. And there were 1 or 2 small excavations, but there was no real concept at all. It was so productive, this excavation, that it seemed necessary to do something about it. And excavations committees like Sam Frere's at Raymond were then quite the mood, and so I suggested that we should establish the Winchester Excavations Committee. The then mayor, who became a very great friend, and her husband became eventually my best man, she took this up with fervour and called a meeting in Guildhall, which was attended, it's unbelievable, by 700 people, who gave her the instruction, which of course is what she asked for, to found an excavations committee. And that is what has conducted the excavations ever since, and now deals with the publications, to which I'll come in a few moments. Now, it is impossible to work in Winchester in 7 or 8 weeks initially, and then over a longer period as this particular part of the excavation came towards its end, without realizing the extraordinary wealth of the archaeological deposit, which would have been destroyed on this site completely without record, for there are massive basements below the Wessex Hotel, and would be destroyed on other sites. And so this resulted in what I suppose today I have to call a manifesto. In the first 2 of the 10 annual interim reports that we published, I wrote that the committee had been founded to undertake excavations both in advance of building projects and on sites not so threatened, aimed at studying the development of Winchester as a town from its earliest origins down to the establishment of the modern city in the Victorian period. The centre of interest, I wrote in the first interim report, is the city itself, not any one period of its past, nor any one part of its remains. But I allowed myself to say, we can hope that this approach may in particular throw light upon the end of the Roman city and on the establishment and development of the Saxon town, problems as vital to our understanding of urban development in this country as they are difficult to solve. And I'll show you later how we have begun to solve them. And I insisted that it was essential to this study that the study and interpretation of documentary evidence, written evidence, should go hand in hand with archaeological research. For the existence of documentary materials, I wrote in that first interim report, greatly enhances the possibilities of interpretation inherent in the archaeological results and vice versa. Well, we carried out a second year's excavation on a rather small scale, but we did discover the site of the great Oldminster Church, to which I shall come, and we now planned 6 more years at least. And in the second report wrote, involving important research programs into various scientific problems, biological, botanical and physical. I owe this to the Disney professors here in this university and to all I learnt when I was here in the 50s. Throughout, emphasis has been and will continue to be laid on the use of all the available evidence, documentary, archaeological, scientific, to study the development of Winchester as an urban environment and of the inhabitants in interrelation with that environment over a period of 2,000 years. Well, 10 more seasons of excavations followed, 10 interim reports. There was a certain amount of opposition. We tended to label all our layers, as Sir Mortimer Wheeler had done, but with rather brightly white labels. And the then editor of the Antiquaries Journal asked if we would kindly take the labels off, because it spoilt the photographs in the Antiquaries Journal. It wasn't a request to which I acceded. Some 3,000 volunteers took part. No one was paid except the army cook. We got an army camp initially for free from the army at Bushfield, which some people will remember. And in 1965, we had volunteers from 26 countries and won the Duke of Edinburgh's Award for International Cooperation that year. But the change came in 1966, 1968. The question was how to study and publish the material being recovered from excavations and the associated documentary research. In that summer of 1966, my late wife Bertha Colby-Biddle, and I were invited by Professor Witold Hensel of the Polish Academy of Sciences to go and see the work being done in Polish towns. We went through half a dozen of them, from Opola deep in the south to Wrocław Gdańsk in the north. And everywhere we saw that each town had its own team, and that is what led to the decision to found the Winchester Research Unit to research and publish the results of the excavations we've been undertaking in Winchester, and indeed the allied research in documentary history and the natural sciences in a series of Winchester studies to be published by Oxford University Press. And the work of the research unit, which we set up in the 18 months after return from Poland, with help from many people, the government, the local authorities, many individuals and so on, was such that we could begin work on the 1st of October 1968. And I have to tell you that today, 49 years later, we are still in action. Indeed, that's the publications to date. We are publishing, in addition to the interim reports, a series of volumes with Oxford University Press. You see some of them stacked up on the right there, and you'll see on the left-hand side the latest volume by my friend and colleague Connie Stucker, which traces the biological and human evolution of the populations of Winchester from about 250 AD right through uninterruptedly until about 1550 AD. Not only are we very lucky to have had the enormous excavations at Lank Hills, initiated by the Winchester Schools Archaeological Committee, and helped greatly, I think, by our technical facilities, but also by the more recent excavations by Wessex Archaeology, so that our Romano-British sample alone is over 700 bodies. And then for the Anglo-Saxon, I mean Christian Anglo-Saxon medieval period, about another 2,000 bodies. And then, marvellously, because the editor of this volume, Connie Stuckert, then at the University of Pennsylvania, had come to talk about what she should do as a doctoral thesis. And she was very interested in population change, and we said, well, one of our big problems is in what ways, if any, did the physical population change between the Romano-British period and the later Anglo-Saxon, the medieval period. And it was possible in Hampshire because the early Anglo-Saxons, how will we say, the 5th to the 7th or early 8th century, inhumed their dead. They did not cremate them, so that when people excavated their cemeteries, their skeletons could be recovered and could be studied in exactly the same way, as Connie did, as the skeletons from the Roman cemeteries before and the Anglo-Saxon and medieval cemeteries later. And there's been a good deal of this in the press recently. Norman himself, who has followed these excavations throughout the years since 1967, when he first began writing for the Times, I think reported on us every year, had a very fine article a couple of weeks ago, just before we had the launch party for the people of early Winchester that you see here, and I understand there's another article just to come. Now, that's journalism at its highest, but it also, of course, is enormously important in gathering, garnering, and maintaining local support. I may say that today we don't apply to major trusts, and well, we do, to major trusts and foundations, but not the Arts and Humanities Research Council and so forth. What we do is we have a close network of major Hampshire figures who have contacts in every aspect of society, and we are very, very fortunate that their links to major foundations have been successful. The Linbury Trust, for example, one of the Sainsbury Trusts, in providing us with the money to keep going on the publication of this work. So there we are, 49 years after we set up. We've published 8 volumes, enormous number of pages and plates and figures and tables, and we've got 4 more going at the moment. So that much by way of introduction. I want now to talk about Winchester and say a little bit about what sort of place was Winchester over the last 2,000 years, and how did it change over that time. Well, you all, of course, know approximately where Winchester is. It's there. It's at the head of Southampton Water, with Southampton here. It's in a strategically, vitally important position. But not, and this will be relevant later in the story, not as significant as the great opening of the Thames to the Channel and the short route to the continent. This was a longer way. So what happened at Winchester? On the right-hand side, you can see an indication of the evolution of the city over the 2,000 years that there has been human habitation on that spot. The first stirrings in the top left corner were control of an east-west route on the top of the Great Downs, running along the top of the chalk downs from far to the west to far to the east. And at this point, they crossed the narrowest point of the valley where the Itchen cuts through the chalk down to Southampton Water. And control of that route, in the top left corner, was established sometime in the later 2nd or 1st century BC by a very large, 22 hectare, Iron Age hill slope enclosure. We know quite a lot about its shape now, but we don't know much about its interior. Some of it lies inside the city, and Kate Pretty, who of course is here today, actually took part in the excavation of part of that in 1966. We're gradually getting more and more information about it, but it doesn't seem to have lasted very long. And although it's fairly clear that it does command this route, there doesn't seem to be much there in the later 1st century BC, or indeed in the 1st centuries AD. But then things begin to move. After that pause, there seems to have been a fort in the valley floor. We've only got one corner of it, and I don't suppose you'll see anything of it there, but it's about there. It's one corner of a major military type fort. We don't know how big it is. It's a very big ditch, but we don't know how big the enclosure was. We suspect that it is a cohort fort, no reason to suppose anything larger, probably from some element of Legio II Augusta, coming through this area in the latter part of the first years, or first days almost, of the Roman invasion. Nothing more happens after that immediately, but a little bit later, a Roman north-south route comes right through the site. There, it's already on that one, there, and it's there apparently before any other occupation. We can't be quite sure because of the difficulties of finding large areas to excavate, but it looks like a Roman long-distance north-south route to and from the Solent. There may have been an east-west route at the same time, we don't yet know. There may have been some slight occupation in the later Claudian Neronian period. We have a certain amount of ceramics from that period, but nothing certainly in the way of activity. But then there comes a major development. About AD 70, or possibly as much as 5 years later, a rampart and ditch of military inspiration enclosing 58 hectares, that's 144 acres, with 4 gates was laid out, and you see it in the top right-hand picture there. One of the gates was fully excavated, a timber gate. It's absolutely in the tradition of what we know of Roman military timber gates, both from this province and from the adjacent continental provinces. And this area is extraordinary. It makes Winchester the 5th largest town of Roman Britain. And at the time it was laid out, there's the gate, you can see there, and you can see what I've been talking about with the slide more clearly here. The ditched enclosure is down there, possibly military one there. There you've got the street plan there, you've got your 58 hectare site with a street grid of the same date. Simon Esmond Cleary showed some years ago how extraordinary Winchester in the 70s is. And as I've written underneath that slide, by about 75, the defences of Venta Belgarum, Venta, the place, marketplace perhaps, difficult word, of the Belgic people, enclosed 58 hectares, 5th largest town in Roman Britain, the largest tribal capital, cantonal capital if you like, of the province at any date. We don't know why this is the case. There's not a great deal yet known about what's happening inside it. It has a wonderful street grid, and we suspect, and Simon Esmond Cleary's drawing perhaps emphasises this a bit, that it might be a centre established either in the last days of the rule of King Cogidubnus, normally associated with Chichester, but ruling several civitates, several tribal places, an arrangement made either shortly before his death in anticipation of the changes that would have to be made when this remarkably powerful local ruler was no longer with us, or perhaps after his death. We don't know the results of this, but it is this astonishing fact of this great size, and those defences are exactly the same line of the defences that were followed by Roman Winchester throughout its time, same position of the gates, same line of the defences, and moreover, they are the site also, as I shall show later, of the replanning and redefencing of the city in the 9th century. And they are the streets which still define the plan of Winchester today, and we still go in and out of the city, if not exactly on top of the Roman gates, because there was a period when they were lost, then at least very close to them. So there's an inheritance there of considerable importance. I'm not going to go in detail through what happened to Winchester during those Roman years. It's a long story. We are gradually learning more and more about it. And in fact, the next slide will show something of how our knowledge of Winchester is developing. By my colleague, Francis Morris, has been working on all the records we have of the discovery of Roman buildings. Normally, it's bits of tessellated floors is what get recorded, as by Raymond, our architect, in 1685, when building a great castle, a great palace up on that site there in that salient. But there's a huge amount of material in local newspapers. It's very difficult to track down. There are X, Y, and Z found under Mr. Perkins' shop. Where the devil with Mr. Perkins' shop? Well, you can find out by very careful analysis of the many town handbooks there are. Very few copies often surviving, but they can be found. And gradually you can plot it out. And you can see the density of the information which is becoming available on the left-hand side, the forum in the middle from excavation, houses there from excavation, temple and so forth from excavation up there. But much of this is small excavations, or indeed huge amounts of material from simply combing newspapers, combing local antiquarian society things. And you can, for example, build up a distribution of how many buildings there are from present tessellated floors and so forth. I'm not pretending it's anything like a proper history of Roman Winchester, of Venta Velgarum, but we're getting there. And on the left-hand side, just finally, because we're going to come back to its later transmogrification, this plan of the street plan with 38 insulae, centred on the forum, which is found in excavation. So some progress is being made on the investigation of Roman Winchester. What happened to it later in its history is becoming known from the sites that have been properly excavated and from the study, for example, of the coin series and that kind of thing. There's undoubtedly, it throve in the 2nd and 3rd century and developed quite normally during that period. The defences were reconstructed on the same line as the defences of the 70s AD, in earth and timber in the later 2nd century, and they were provided with a stone wall, which we'll come back to, and stone gates, although again only one of the gates has been investigated, the south gate. Of course, mercifully, the modern road lies to one side of it, and we've been able to excavate it. We were given 3 days to do so. We stayed 6 weeks. But it was vital to get that sequence. Unfortunately, Mr. Tutt's veterinary surgery next door was being undermined by the developers, so we got more time than we thought we'd have. But that produced the timber gate of the mid-1st century, after the middle of the 1st century, and then reconstruction right down to stone gate, magnificent entry to the gate. The gate itself lies under an adjacent street of some time in the 3rd century. And then finally, bastions were added to the outside of the city wall. They've only been properly investigated on this one site at Southgate, but we've got hints of them at one certainly, and possibly 2 other sites, and these will be some form of late Roman reinforced defences of Winchester. For what is, of course, the question. It was a civilised place. We've never found the baths, but we have a piped water supply from 20 kilometres north of the city in an open aqueduct, but we know nothing else about the other public buildings as yet, and when they are discovered it will almost certainly be by chance on some new development. They haven't got a theatre, but almost certainly is one. I'd imagine there will certainly be a McKellum, I think, great big store in a sense, really. Not a storehouse, but a great big marketing place. But we don't have those at all. And so Winchester gets through the Roman period. There's a lot happening in the later 3rd and 4th century AD. Outside the North Gate, we have the cemetery of Lank Hills, excavated by Giles Clark of Winchester College, up in that area, and published by him, and then subsequently further excavations from Wessex Archaeology, which means, as I mentioned earlier, we've got some 700 Roman skeletons perfectly well excavated from that site for study of the scientific population. But then, amazingly, that cemetery stops. We have an extraordinary photograph looking across it, and the front of the photograph, the ground cut into the chalk is densely cut by graves, and they get thinner and thinner, and in the background they've gone. The chalk is just natural. It's the end of organised burial with burial clubs or whatever way it was arranged in the Roman city. So what indeed does happen to Winchester at the end of the Roman period? Well, it becomes a husk. The coin series is not remarkable. I mean, plenty of them, but it doesn't go down much later than Honorius. I don't think it's any later. Though there are Byzantine coins, but they're later still. We can't put our fingers really on any structures inside the city. But we have a problem, because in the 7th century, a very important church is founded in the centre of the walled city by the Anglo-Saxon King of Wessex, dated a little bit uncertain, say 650, probably better than grabbing at an earlier date, which some people do simply by looking at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. A very important church is founded. Why? Now, on the continent, our colleagues working particularly in the Rhineland and in the upper waters of the Danube as well, have noticed that when the Roman settlements deteriorate, there is still often a concentration of pagan settlements by whoever are the incomers in the countryside round about. And that is exactly what we found at Winchester. On the left-hand side here, we have a plan I published some years ago with my wife Bertha, one of her last papers in 2007, which shows the Solent at the bottom and the River Itching running up towards Winchester at the centre of the circle, and then a distribution. You don't need to look at the details, nor could you, of course. Distribution of 5th to 7th century finds, whether they're cemeteries or individual finds of metal or very few coins, as we then knew them. On the right-hand side, prepared for this talk, Francis Morris has produced the latest possible analysis of all the PAS data, the Portable Antiquity Scheme data, right up to the present day. And what you'll see is that we're certainly getting this business up the north here clarified and linked, and we have some excavations of major timber hall-like structures there beside the Roman road running up in this direction, and actually aligned either parallel to or at right angles to it, suggesting that this is remaining a routeway in the 6th, 7th century. We have another great concentration down here, and there are scattered other finds. It's very difficult with some of the PAS material, because the coins in particular are very, very rarely given precise references, either because they're withheld by PAS, and somebody here may be able to enlighten me on that, or it may be that the finders are unwilling to reveal where they're finding them in any detail. So they cannot be plotted, because we normally only have rather short map references. But this is all material that can be plotted, and you can see it here. And it is quite clear, I think, Certainly our German colleagues, looking at the Rhineland, former Roman forts and small towns, would accept this, that we have a focus in Winchester. Something is happening which is attracting, and you'll notice it is a Winchester attraction. If you look at the map on the left-hand side, much wider area, admittedly some years ago, but it's the Winchester concentration which is the interesting thing, and that is really informed by what we see here on the right. And I think that the view would be that a husk-like, perhaps, Roman settlement was not perhaps quite so husk, but what was important there probably occupies a quite small area and may or may not have been found by excavation. In our case, I think we can say certainly has not been found, but we have got Germanic material of the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, a magnificent triangular bone comb of a type of Horst Wolfgang Böhmer has studied in great detail. We've consulted him on that. Found from a pit cut into the ruins of the Forum, was actually underneath the 1st, 7th century church. We've got Germanic pottery from one site, from something that probably is a sunken hut, a Grubenhaus, which is so similar to the material from the Fegesenwerder in the German part of the Danish peninsula near Kiel, that when Klaus Schmidt and I laid them out together in the museum there, I'm very glad our material and their material was marked, because you would not have been able to tell material from Winchester from the materials coming from the Fegesenwerder broadly in the 5th, perhaps early 6th century. That's an exceptional site, perhaps. It just happens to be in one of the big areas of ordinary urban Winchester that we have excavated, and we were lucky enough to get this material. Of course, it's very rare that this sort of stuff is picked up on development sites. It's very uninteresting. It doesn't look like anything significant, and it has to be proper excavations that do it. But the story, I think, is coming. And so the husk that was Roman Winchester has something in it, and that something that's in it controls what happens next. There you see on the left-hand side the Roman Forum and the southeast part of the arrangement of the insulae, and you can see streets careering in red across it, which are post-Roman, and you see the site of the 7th century church there, the 7th century Old Minster, about which we'll hear a lot more in the next few minutes. I'll come to the church in its sequence. Why was it there? Well, obviously, in my view, because there is something remaining inside that Roman husk, if you like. It's not a husk as you might think, there's a nut or a kernel of some sort. I suspect it's a high-status secular establishment, and that is the reason why Birinus, his name incidentally in Latin should be Virinus, but it's always written Birinus. Probably he signed himself with a B rather than a V, but it's Virinus, which is an important Roman high-status name occurring in inscriptions from Rome in the 6th and 7th century, and he was actually sent from the household of the Pope, the then Pope, to Genoa, where he was consecrated by the Bishop of Milan in exile. All this is in Bede, and it's accurate. Milan was in the hands of the Orthodox at that time, and its bishop was on exile. So he arrives, comes to Dorchester-on-Thames. There's material in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle about Dorchester, about the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon kings and so forth there. This church, I don't think I'm going to attempt to argue, is as early as Dorchester, 635. We know it's there by 663 because there's a bishop who's intruded by the King of Wessex to form a new bishopric there, and the beginning of a very long Winchester line. But there we've got a kernel to which we are now going to come. The excavation of Oldminster, of the Anglo-Saxon cathedral, called Oldminster because there is a new minster of almost equal social importance founded immediately north of it just after 900. The excavation of that, which was carried out almost entirely under the direction of my wife Beata, you can see in a series of diagrams there from the 7th century right down to the late 9th. We haven't time, of course, to pause on that, but you may like to see some of the excavation here on this side the eastern apse, which you see there. We know the exact dates of this from documents, completely robbed out or almost completely robbed out. And then this astonishing northern apse here of that building, which was created around the tomb of Swithin, which is there, a massive double apse structure of which there are parallels. It is 99 long Roman feet precisely from north to south. That is the interior diameter of Charlemagne's octagon Aachen, and is also the interior diameter of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Medieval people didn't build copies of buildings. They built into buildings certain features which were essential. And it does look as though this structure is around the tomb of Swithin, to honour Swithin, is probably of that kind. It didn't survive, by the way. They had no idea there were Roman streets running underneath it, and so their foundations broke over the edge of the Roman streets, and they replaced it by the great towered structure that you see there, which survives right to the end of Anglo-Saxon Winchester. So, and there you see another plan. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can see basically, it's all published, all this is published, the great work on the Anglo-Saxon ministers of Winchester, which was essentially finished when Bertha died, is our top priority for this coming working year. And there is a reconstruction of it by our marvellous artist Simon Hayfield on the right. As you see, the remains of the plan have been laid out beside the nave of the Norman cathedral. Right, it's Gothic there, but it's the Norman nave. And then on the right-hand side, you see how that building has been reconstructed. This is not the occasion, nor is it the time, to go into any kind of analysis of that structure, but it is huge. And because no Anglo-Saxon cathedral church survives, the scale of Anglo-Saxon major ecclesiastical architecture has been completely unable to be evaluated. This building is bigger than Charlemagne's church at Aachen. And that is, all right, it's later too in its final form, nearly 200 years later, but it's very, very big. And beside it, on the right-hand side there, there's another church known as Newminster, to separate it from Oldminster, which was a major royal burial church from 900 onwards, down to the moment when, after the conquest, it was moved to become Hyde Abbey in the northern suburb of Winchester. So let's just look briefly. We're coming to grips now with Norman's challenge of the ancient capital. Here is a colossal complex of the late Anglo-Saxon period. The great church we looked at in some detail, the Newminster north of it, various other buildings of it, as you can see here. Those buildings are not isolated in the city. There is undoubtedly a secular complex to which they relate, but it's completely impossible to get at. It's here. In the Anglo-Saxon period, by the time we get to the Norman period, as you see there, we know that it was doubled in size, that William the Conqueror built an aula there. Having taken this land from Newminster, he gave it some land elsewhere in the county, and there's a big palace complex in that area. And as we go on, you'll see that you then come to that colossal church that is there today. Now, Eric Fenley, who I think we must all regard as the leading scholar of English Romanesque architecture, has this memorable and percipient phrase, I think, a Cathedral of Imperial pretensions. Now, Eric is somebody who loves his spire and wouldn't easily say that anything here was matching what was happening, as it were, over there. But my goodness me, look at this. Those are the plans of the great churches of the early Norman period. There's Winchester, begun in 1079. There we have it there. St Paul's a century and more later. Cluny almost the same time, usually recognised as absolutely the greatest church of the late 11th century in Europe. And Canterbury, insofar as you know it, rather smaller. Westminster of the Confessors period. Speyer, you see, there is the marvellous church which survives, which is the great imperial church of the German Reich at that time. And then, of course, up here, looking a little sad, really, St. Peter's. Those of you who know St. Peter's well will know the little brass plaques that are laid in the floor of the nave all the way along to show how much bigger St. Peter's is than anything else. The only problem is that the Winchester plaque is outside the west door. But there we are, that's honest scholarship for you. This is an immense building. Now, I've emphasized this because we must look at what it represents. Inside Winchester Cathedral are royal tombs. They are being investigated at the moment in great detail. They exist in chests, the mortuary chests of the 16th century, 1525, which stand on top of the screens. Now, those chests have been investigated in great detail in recent years. The bones, I'm sorry, are all out now. The chests are back, but the bones are still being studied. I'm sworn to have been known kind of secrecy about any results, I'm afraid, by the formidable Receiver General of the Cathedral. But we think we have got 2 intact burials in the cathedral, never touched since the late 11th century. On the bottom left here, you've got the Latin inscription. Within is the body of Richard and of William the Older, the son, and of Bjorn the Earl. When that was opened in the 1880s, a massive great lead chest was found inside it, the top of which is inscribed in scratched inscriptions in writing which Sandy Hislop, who's the great authority on this period, tells us is certainly late 11th century. That's presumably the chest in which they were removed from Oldminster in 1093 when the monks left their beloved church and went into the new church, and the demolition of the old started the next day. But here, he who lies here carried the sceptre of the King of Rain, Harthacanute. Of Emma and Canute he was born, and he then died at a date there. We think there's another untouched lead coffin brought from Oldminster there, in which case it will be the only known surviving Anglo-Saxon royal burial. There is another, the burial of Edward the Confessor. It was opened in the 18th century. It has been extensively studied. We must imagine there may be a sceptre, as there was in Edward the Confessor's, now lost. There may be Byzantine textiles, as there was in Edward the Confessor's, very badly preserved, but we have them, and so forth. So great possibilities here. The only point I want to make at the moment is that this is the Royal Burial Church. Now here we're going to move on and come to the end, because there you've got the late Saxon situation, the great churches with the putative royal burial royal palace there, and then in the Norman period we've got the great Norman church of imperial pretension, as Eric has said, and now we see other palaces. The Norman Royal Castle, in which Domesday Book was kept and the treasure was kept in the late 11th century, and the Bishop's Palace at Wolvesey, an enormous stone hall there to be greatly enlarged quite soon. There just very quickly is the castle. It's a major monument, of course. If we had not had the castle destroyed in 1651 by Commonwealth, it would be like one of those massive great French medieval chateaux rising up above the town, with 5 great round towers all along this side, dominating the town, but interestingly not on the outside. In fact, the site was taken by Charles II, and this was the beginning of the King's House, the Royal Palace that was built there. You can see all these royal sites on this air photograph, the earliest one. There we've been concentrating on the cathedral. There we have the site, such as it survives, of the now completely vanished, really almost vanished, castle, apart from the Great Hall. And here we have the Bishop's Palace at Wolvesey. So this is just an indication of the kind of detail from the Norman castle. There's Henry I's North Tower. I may say that has mostly been destroyed. This would not have happened today, but in the 1970s it was dug out by the county council to make room for a great monumental concrete stair lined with granite, which is not the normal stone in Hampshire. And then there is a view of the tremendous development of the Palace of the Bishops from, it was started here in the 990s probably, but this is the West Hall, which is late 11th, very early 12th century, and there is the hall built by Henry of Blois when he hoped to become the papal representative in Winchester, and perhaps to try eventually for the papacy itself. So these are very remarkable and major structures. But that is what comes next. All the evidence suggests that the Blütezeit, if you like, the great period of flourishing of Royal Winchester is from the middle of the 11th to the perhaps 1130s, 1140s. There's then a great battle in Winchester in the Civil War between Stephen and Matilda. The Conqueror's Hall is burnt out. We don't know how big it is. Various of us think from the land tenure documents that it's very nearly as big as Westminster Hall, but it was destroyed by fire and fighting in the early 12th century, and that marks the end. Now, if you're going to talk about ancient capital, I think we can define this quite clearly as something that was emerging in the 10th century, but was certainly very, very clear, shall we say, by the reign of Edward the Confessor, who was crowned in the church in 1040, in the cathedral, the Anglo-Saxon cathedral in 1043, but in 1141 suffered a tremendous disaster by the burning of Winchester at that time, which damaged many of the major Norman buildings. And from then on, Winchester goes into a long decline. So yes, I think there is a period in which reasonably one can think of Winchester as a place where secular and ecclesiastical and intellectual power in the remarkable productions of the Oldminster Cathedral and of the Newminster Church can be seen to have acted in some sort like a centralized modern place that might be called a capital. Of course, we have no idea about the bureaucracy, whether there was permanent bureaucratic offices in the palace here, but we do of course know from studying Domesday Book alone, which is called the Book of Winchester and was kept first of all in the castle, we do know that a huge mass of documentary evidence must lie behind Domesday Book, or it could never have been compiled. There are offices somewhere. We obviously know no more, but I think the title of ancient capital, which is sometimes used by local patriots rather loosely, I think you can define by archaeology, by documents, by architecture, a period in which at least it's an early capital, to use a more archaeological paraphrase, as it were. It's beginning to be something that is a central place in the imagination and in the feelings of the country. It didn't last. It was all to become much quieter. But the Winchester we see today is still defined by the walls that were laid out of a remarkably large Roman urbanizing place in the 70s AD, and the streets upon which we walk are the streets laid out probably in the reign of Alfred. It might be a little bit earlier, it might probably not be, a little bit later, on a regular street plan. And I'll end with just one story. When I first presented the evidence for the Anglo-Saxon street plan of an organised grid at Winchester at a meeting in All Souls in 1967, I was told that was quite impossible. We don't have regular planned times until the time of Edward III or Edward I, and it couldn't possibly be the case. Well, I'm afraid it is the case, and Winchester's not the only example of it. But it survives to this day, and the elements of that plan, which I've not had time to talk about this evening, show that it was intended to be an intensely commercial settlement with back streets to either side of the high street to allow access to the very valuable high street properties for supply and distribution of goods. And so yes, there is a period when reasonably, I think, you can see Winchester as a formative urban place in Anglo-Saxon society, and I think we're not too far out of it if we call it the ancient capital, providing that we're careful how we define that. Thank you.
Just before we go there, I'd just like to say a few words it really is a remarkable opportunity for me to review Winchester, which has been so pivotal to the creation and the understanding of medieval archaeology and medieval urban archaeology in Britain. And it's been a project under Professor's leadership which is truly unique, and it's unique in a whole series of facets. It's certainly unique in its scope, in envisioning from the very beginning, for the first interim report, that it would take the settlement as a whole as its unit of analysis. Unique in covering the whole of the chronology of the settlement, the better part of 2 millennia. Unique in, from its inception, including both a concern for rescue and for research excavations within its remit. Of course, the Winchester project was also unique in its scale as an actual physical archaeological undertaking. We hear about 3,000 volunteers, for instance. Consider the logistics. It sometimes says if it weren't for the politics and the logistic, archaeology would be easy. This was clearly not an easy.
Not all at once, I may say.
Indeed. It's nevertheless, it's quite clear that the scale of the undertaking over the lifetime of an extraordinary career. Also unique in terms of its interdisciplinarity. I've been working with material from Winchester, as it happens, in fact, just this week and over the last 3 years. And it never ceases to impress me the degree to which archaeological science was integrated fully and progressively into all of the elements of the Winchester publications. In a discipline which is sometimes wrongly, I would say, as a medievalist, of course, which in the early periods of its history was not necessarily perceived as being fully interdisciplinary in terms of the integration of environmental and scientific approaches. They're absolutely fundamental. And equally, the integration of the historical record, including entire volumes within the publication series, and the Winton's Doomsday, for instance. And next, in terms of the openness to inspiration of the project, including, as we've heard, across the then Iron Curtain, with the fundamental influence of urban archaeology in Poland in terms of the creation of the Winchester Excavation Unit and the publication program, which leads me to the publication record, which is equally unique. It's a publication series which firstly integrates the settlement, not only single excavations, which at 8 volumes is measured in kilograms rather than pages. I haven't actually lined them up on my shelf, but I suspect it's reaching a metre in terms of shelf space, and certainly unique in terms of the impact that publication record has had. Which leads me to the last thing, which is the long-term influence of Martin's excavation program at Winchester. Certainly it has fundamentally shaped understanding of urban origins and development within medieval archaeology in Britain and internationally. Not least, it has trained not only a generation, but generations of influential medieval archaeologists in Britain and internationally. And last of all, it's left an extraordinarily important and well-organized excavation archive, which continues to produce new research as recently as we've seen as the past weeks with Volume 8, publication on the biological anthropology, and in fact as an archive which I've been very privileged to use in the last 18 months myself. So with no further ado, I would like to once again thank Professor Biddle on behalf of us all for an extraordinary presentation, an extraordinary excavation program, and an extraordinary career. Thank you.
That's very kind. You're very good.